Alan. Yeah, so based on my little history there, you can see I've had quite a few very different jobs in the last, since I started working. But after graduating from museum studies school, I've most often been working at historical societies as an exhibit designer. And what that does for a person is kind of makes you a subject expert in these very particular things. I couldn't say I was an expert in all of Pacific Northwest history, but I can tell you a lot about Washington State suffrage history. And I can tell you a lot about Japanese American resettlement post-World War II. And I can tell you a lot about the Navy base at Magnuson Park. So if anybody wants to talk about any of those topics, let me know. Today, we're going to be talking about Washington State suffrage history, and as Alan mentioned, I was the coordinator for the Suffrage Centennial in 2020. So in 2020, we celebrated 100 years since the passage of the 19th Amendment, and in that role, I gave presentations like this, and wrote an exhibit about the history, and it's such a pleasure to have that background and expertise still wanted around. So I'm happy to be here to share that with you. I'm going to start with women organizing. Like when did women start organizing in the first place, getting together in groups and starting to advocate for causes that they believed in? And women really started organizing in the States during the anti-slavery movement in the early 19th century. There was a huge overlap in abolitionists, women who wanted to see slavery abolished, and the early women's rights activists. So these early women wanted to pass reform legislation, but politicians were unwilling to listen to them because they were a disenfranchised group. They don't have any voting power, so why do the interests of women matter at this point? Most people say that the women's rights movement began officially at the Seneca Falls Convention in New York in 1848. And this was a gathering of women who were mostly anti-slavery reformists. And what came out of the convention was a document called the Declaration of Sentiments. And that document laid out the demands of the women's rights movement at the turn of the century here. It included the right to education. It included a broadened professional and economic opportunity for women, and also the freedom of dress. And most controversially, even for the women present at this very progressive gathering, was the right to vote. Not all women, even at this convention, thought women should vote. Why was it such a controversial ask? So even amongst women, it was controversial. The women's sphere at the time was widely believed to be in the home. And anti-suffragists, which were mostly women then, argued that the delicacies of a woman had no place in the dirty world of politics. And politics at the time, you can imagine, like, the voting booths were not as they were today, like these very organized, clean kind of places where you can, they were outside of saloons and like in kind of the dirty parts of town where drunken men would mingle, and women would just not even be present in those kinds of places where voting was happening. And in these trials, women were not allowed to be jurors at the time either. And part of that was to protect the sensibilities of the sensitive, souls of women from hearing about gruesome crimes and hearing about, these terrible things that people were being, put on trial for. Other anti-suffragists' arguments that are fun to think about are that women were fickle, silly creatures, prone to hysteria, who could not be counted on to make intelligent political decisions. And there was also a perception that there was a finite amount of energy in the body, which supported a notion that if women were more civically engaged, the mental exertion of voting and understanding the politics would jeopardize their reproductive health. That's literally what they believed, that they, women just don't have the space in their bodies to consider the problems of the world because they need to be able to give birth. And these attitudes, as strange as they are to us today, took decades to change. 72 years, actually, if you count back from the Seneca Falls Convention in 1948 until the 19th Amendment in 1920. Something interesting about the suffrage movement in America is that it was it took hold in the West and moved eastward. And there are several theories as to why that is. The first states to pass suffrage were Wyoming, Colorado, Idaho, Utah, and Washington. And at the time, these areas had fairly low populations of women to begin with. Like the eastern states are much more established, and the southern states are much more established at the turn of the century. One theory about how Washington state specifically became a leader in the suffrage movement in the West is that Catherine Payne Blaine, who was at Seneca Falls Convention, she was the youngest signer of the Declaration of Sentiments at 18 years old. That she left New York and came to the States to marry her husband, Mr. Blaine, and brought with her the ideas from those progressive ideas to Washington with her. And the Blaines were friends with the Denny's, as in Arthur Denny, Denny Way, Denny Park. And that she and her husband, she brought those ideas with her, she shared them with her husband, she shared them with the Denny's, and then 6 years after the Seneca Falls Convention, Arthur Denny introduces the first suffrage bill to Washington Territory. It doesn't pass. It loses 8-9. And if it had passed, Washington would have been the first territory in the states to pass suffrage. And some historians say that the language of the bill was that to allow white females over the age of 18 to vote. And at the time, most of the pioneering men in government in Washington Territory were married to indigenous women. And some postulate that if Denny had included indigenous women in his bill, in his proposal, that it may have passed. It was pretty close. There are other theories as to why suffrage movement took hold in the West. It could have been that pioneer women in these territories were just tough as nails, and that they became more respected as equals in both brains and brawn by their male counterparts. So the men just, they're early on in like the beginnings of their territories. They're clearing land and they're building towns, and women and men are both putting in a lot of effort. Whereas maybe in the East Coast, there's a lot more of like a finery about women and like a separation of the genders. Whereas out here, everybody's pulling their weight. It could be also that the men in these newer territories thought by extending voting rights to women that it would attract the fairer sex to those areas. So there weren't a lot of women out here wanting to be pioneers in these uncharted territories. And so some of these states, I think Wyoming and Utah particularly, passed voting rights for women as a way of incentivizing women to come to those areas. Regardless, it didn't mean that the women in the West didn't have to fight tooth and nail for suffrage. So let's talk about some of the false starts that women's voting rights experienced in Washington. After Denny's bill failed, the subject of women's votes went silent until 1867, when Washington Territorial Legislature passed a law giving the right to vote to all white citizens above the age of 21. Now that begs the question, are women citizens? Early suffragists in Washington rallied around the term citizen, citing the 14th Constitutional Amendment definition of citizen being all persons born or naturalized in the United States. It's pretty obvious, right? Women are citizens. We were born and naturalized in the United States. And this was the same tactic that Susan B. Anthony went to go vote for the first time, saying, like, I'm a citizen, and citing the 14th Amendment. And then she was arrested, if you recall. She was arrested for attempting to cast an illegal ballot. And they're like, you're going to be fined some amount of money, $2, which was probably $200 back then. And she said, I'll never pay it, not a dime. And she never did. So early women suffragists are trying to cast their votes using this citizenship definition. Our own Mary Olney Brown, who was a resident of Olympia and a doctor and just like a really smart cookie, she attempted to cast her vote in 1869, but was turned away, told she was not a citizen. And in 1870, she tried again and was again denied. But at the same time, in 1870, her sister, Charlotte Olney French, and several other women in Grand Mound, Washington, were able to cast their ballots successfully. And this may have to do with, they went to the ballots early and like threw a picnic and invited the men who were working the voting booths and kind of like buttered them up a little bit, and then as a group, descended upon them and said, we're all casting our votes and you can't stop us. And that was enough. And after they cast their votes, they sent a rider on a horse to go and proclaim to the nearest towns, to other women, like, basically, the women are voting, the women are voting. And people in the towns nearby also were able to cast their votes. So this was the first successful voting in Washington in 1870. But was it the first time a woman cast a ballot? Some people say that Sacagawea should really get that claim. She was the first to cast a vote in Washington. If you count the Lewis and Clark Expedition Party, which included Sacagawea, the ranging party took votes every evening to decide which rivers they would cross, where they would make camp, how they would go about their journeys the following day, and their votes were all counted equally. So perhaps you could say that she was the first to cast a vote in Washington Territory. In 1871, Susan B. Anthony visits Washington Territory. Her visit inspires the creation of suffrage associations in the state and more intense lobbying for voting rights. And that kind of backfired because that same year, territorial legislators enacted a law that declared women could not vote until suffrage became a federal law. Mm-hmm. But her visit did inspire our first generation of really organized suffragists to get moving. In 1875, another suffrage bill fails, was introduced and lost by 11 to 15. A couple of years later, a law was passed enabling women to vote in school elections. So that was something. And all through this time, and really all through suffrage history in Washington, the biggest enemy of women's voting rights was the liquor interests. Purveyors of alcohol were the biggest lobbying powers against women's voting because they feared that if women got the vote, it would affect their business. Because what group of people are suffering the most from alcohol? It's the women and their children who are suffering because their husbands are going out and drinking their paychecks and coming home and abusing them. So of course they're going to take on big alcohol, or big liquor as one of their first items of business, which is what they did in Washington Territory. In 1883, suffrage passes in Washington State. And at the time, only Wyoming and Utah had declared women's suffrage. So we were third in the country.
Is that only white women?
Yes, thank you for that clarification. This is still for white women. No, that's not true. No, in 1883 it says it's still citizens, women citizens, and so Native American women are not able to be citizens yet. Immigrants from Asia are not able to be citizens, but black women and white women are able to vote in Washington in 1883. And actually, I'll skip ahead to this. Black women did vote in Washington in 1883, making them the first able to vote in the country, I believe. When black women in Washington were able to register to vote and vote in 1883 for a short time, as I'll get to. Using their voting rights, the women voted for reforms in local elections. They helped send a Democrat to Congress, which was rare in Washington Territory at the time. Their votes played a role in enacting local prohibition, so no alcohol as well. And the liquor interests were very put out by this. And they started lobbying hard, finding a way to take those voting rights back. In 1887, suffrage was revoked on a technicality. There was a gambler in Tacoma who went to jail, and in his trial, he argued that he should not have, his trial was forfeit because there were women jurors on it, and women should not have been jurors ever. And that ended up bringing the issue to like a higher court who decided that, women couldn't be jurors and also couldn't vote at the time. And so they redacted the suffrage 4 years later. It's confusing, but it's the entire jury of this trial were known anti-suffragists, and so it was kind of like it was a trick. It was like a tricky way of removing those rights. In 1888, suffrage is reinstated again. Like the next year, we got it back. We got voting rights back, but it excluded us from. I say us because most of us in here are, and so it excluded women from serving on juries, though. But that same year, Washington Territorial Supreme Court decides that the federal government had intended to put the word male before citizenship in the Washington Territory Organic Act when establishing voter qualifications. So they're really deciding the intention of a group of people when the language is very clear is pretty tricky, right? So we had it in 1883, we lost it in 1887, we got it back in 1888, we lost it again that same year. And it wasn't until 1906 that there was a big push for women's suffrage in Washington. So the issue kind of died down for, more than a decade. And it was the new push in the 20th century was led by Emma Smith DeVoe of Tacoma. She was a professional organizer for the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and noted suffragist May Arkwright Hutton of Spokane. And she's depicted here wearing a top hat and smoking a cigar, because that was kind of her personality. Emma Smith DeVoe was mentored by Susan B. Anthony. She had been campaigning for suffrage across the country, notably in South Dakota and in Idaho. When Idaho won the vote in 1896 with the help of her organizing, she moved to Washington as a paid organizer under the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Now, Emma is like she believed in the still hunt strategy, which is instead of making these big displays like the suffragists of England were doing. I don't know if you're familiar, but Emmeline Pankhurst and her alike in England were making these big public demonstrations. They were like throwing bricks into windows and getting in fights with police officers and putting on these huge displays. Emma Smith DeVoe thought that would create more enemies to suffrage than it would, or do more harm to the cause than good. And so she argued that, or her strategy in Washington State was to do like the difficult and just like time-consuming work of like person-to-person campaigning, like winning one voter at a time to women's suffrage by being ladylike, by being by maintaining that decorum and that gentility that women were so valued as having, that she would use that to their advantage and appeal to people's respect of women rather than making like a big spectacle of themselves. And you know, that did end up working. Now you've got Emma Smith DeVoe campaigning in Tacoma and around the Puget Sound, and then you've got May Arkwright Hutton, who's in Spokane, and she's got like a little bit of a different tactic. She's a like 6 foot tall, 200+ pound, like zebra coat wearing, red sports car driving, just like in your face lady. She does not give a rip what you have to say, and she's got the opposite tactic of Emma Smith DeVoe. And over the course of them working together, these frenemies, working together to achieve suffrage, they butt heads quite a bit and almost ruin the cause for everybody.
But the black and white picture is May.
This is May here, yeah.
And
these are both, sorry, these are both May, down here. May Arkwright Hutton, and this is Emma Smith DeVoe here.
Oh.
Sorry, that's confusing. This is Emma,
Okay.
this is May. So, yeah, May was doing some things like bribing politicians and, being a little bit more, loud and confrontational. And Emma's been doing this, Emma's singing at her presentations and baking things and being very, very sweet to everyone. And so, of course, Emma thinks that May is just like ruining all of her progress. And they're president and vice president of the Washington State Suffrage Association. So you can kind of get an idea of how frustrating they're both being for each other. Their differences in class, education, appearance, demeanor, political approach caused a lot of antagonism between the president and vice president of the Washington Equal Suffrage Association, which came to a head just before the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition, which was a big World's Fair to be held at University of Washington in 1909. These two women heading up the WESA rallied supporters across the state, and though they nearly tore each other down over differences in personality and approach, eventually did succeed. But first, the 1909 Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition was the big publicity campaign for suffrage in the States. It was this World's Fair. There was 4 million people who visited from all over the world, and the suffragists used it as a major public platform to get their message across of why women needed the vote. And they did it in these most ingenious ways. They used the event, they canvassed for support, they arranged speakers, they distributed suffrage literature, they put pins on everybody, they sent a group of suffragist mountaineers to climb Mount Rainier. So this is a time where women are not thought to be able to do these things, physical feats, right? And the suffragists of Washington sent a group of women, I believe 13 women, to summit Mount Rainier in your bloomers and your dresses with ice picks and bed rolls that, from 1909. You can imagine doing it today with the equipment that we have today, but they're doing it, they're doing it 100 years plus ago. And they planted a Votes for Women flag at the top of Mount Rainier. And there's a picture of it, and it's still there to this day, buried in snow somewhere. And there was also there was a National Women's Suffrage Association meeting held in Seattle the week before AYP, And they arranged for a train to take women, to pick suffragist women, these like big name speakers, to take them through Washington State and stop at all of these major places. They stopped in Spokane, they stopped in Pasco, they stopped in Ellensburg, and all the way to Tacoma. And they spoke at the back of the train, and they distributed flowers and things, and people came from wherever their neighborhoods were to like give them Rainier cherries and apples and whatever specialty items that that area of Washington had. And these are the first like cherries that some of these women have ever had. Like, wow, the wealth of Washington agriculture is so amazing, and these types of flowers are so incredible. The train was called the Suffrage Special. And so it's carrying all these important suffragists to Seattle to help with this big push during the AYP. They created a cookbook. They created pins like these for Women's Suffrage Day. And then things came to a head with May and Emma. Emma starts to slight May, like in the newspapers, saying that she's like, that her real name is Bootleg Mary, and that she has this sordid past from back when she lived in Idaho, that she was working in a maybe a brothel, and that anything she says is not to be believed, and she's Emma's basically throwing her under the bus. And the newspapers pick up on this. The newspapers pick up on this because it's happening during that national convention. Washington is even thrown out of the convention. Both Emma and May and all of their constituents are just tossed out of the convention because of all of the brouhaha. And the newspapers pick up on that. Like, the suffragists are warring, women shake bones of suffrage skeleton, May Hutton after M. DeVoe's scalp. Like, these are the kinds of headlines that are, in the Seattle Times and in the Tacoma Times. And in Spokane, like, newspapers all over are reporting on this. And of course, it's not doing any good for Washington's suffrage cause. But the AYP and their efforts there end up being enough to get them to the finish line. And in 1910, Washington does pass suffrage, and this is permanent this time. They became the fifth state, we became the fifth state in the Union, and the first in the 20th century to pass suffrage. We broke a 14-year stall in the movement. And after we celebrated our victory here in Washington, Colorado, Idaho, California, Oregon, Montana, and many others followed suit like dominoes. So Washington has been called the dam breaker state for this reason. And it's also where we came up with our motto for the centennial of Washington Women Led the Way. And in this little comic here, it shows...
Was this again white or black women were allowed?
Yep. Mm-hmm. Any citizen, women's citizens.
So not indigenous people?
Correct. Indigenous women, I'll talk about that in just a second, but indigenous women, immigrants from Asia, were not citizens yet. And also there were plenty of things that kept black women from casting votes until the Voting Rights Act in 1965 as well. But technically, the language would allow any women citizen at the time. So this comic here shows a few different interests ushering a woman to the ballot. The one is the state grange, one is the farmers union, and one is the I can't read it. Labor unions. So women did collaborate with a lot of different unions to get their votes across. People whose values and would complement women's values. Who wanted women to vote because it would further their cause as well. So, to your point over here, we recognize that while the amendment did give all women who were citizens of the franchise. Many groups were not considered citizens in 1920. So 1910, we have suffrage in Washington for citizens, and it's not until 1920 that the United States, as the federal government, passes the 19th Amendment. The Indian Citizenship Act came 4 years later in 1924, so then all indigenous women are now citizens and can vote. And then by 1952, almost 32 years after the 19th Amendment, most immigrants of Asian descent were able to become citizens.
Oh, would you say more about that?
There were several different groups were given citizenship at different times. So I don't remember exactly like who got it first. Like, you know, it might have been Pacific Islanders were given. Like, I'll have to look it up and get back to you on that. But there were several steps in getting most Asian immigrants the right to vote by 1952. And then even after that, there were decades of struggle to achieve equality at the polls. And we're still working on it. There were poll taxes, literacy tests, and there were other discriminatory practices that barred many from voting until the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which was expanded several times to protect those with limited English abilities, for example. So, I mean, even if the federal government says, yes, you can vote, or like even if, like you saw in Washington Territory, even if the language says that all citizens, any white citizen can vote, there's still, you can come up there and say, like, I'm a citizen, I'm white, whatever the definition of citizen was at the time, like, and there's nothing that says a woman, that being a woman makes you not a citizen. You can still get, like, pushed back on, depending on where we are culturally. But it's misleading to say that the 72-year suffrage movement in America did not involve the hard work and dedication of women from every background. As you can see in this photo here, like, there were women from every background fighting for suffrage rights. Here's a group of women from the Banner State, whichever state that is, who are advocating for women's votes. Very famously, there was a march at the state capitol, a suffrage march with Alice Paul and some of the bigger national suffragists, and they forced black women to march in the back of the parade, which is like a really poor publicity campaign for equal rights. Yeah, but everybody did fight for this common goal, the enfranchisement of women, to make America better. And after 100 years of women voting, I think we could say we've made some great strides. We see women in all areas of politics, women from every background, and if these suffragists could see us now, I think they'd be very, very proud of our progress, though we have a lot left to go. Thank you. I'd love to answer any questions, and if I can't answer your question right away, I'd love to be given just a moment to look that up for you, because I know that there are, in your question about Asian immigrants getting the right to vote kind of like incrementally, and most of them having it by 1952, I'll just need to refresh my memory about exactly what those steps were.
And I have the microphone for anyone who has questions.
You said that we passed a law in Washington that we couldn't have the vote until it was approved nationally.
Right.
But we did approve it before it was national.
Right, yeah. These are great questions.
That didn't have any effect, whatever they passed?
Yeah, what I've learned from researching this is that, like, you can pass a law, or you can pass some legislation, and then redact it very quickly afterwards with some little, little twist. And so that's a great question. It's actually never come up that they did pass a law saying, or they passed. Let's see, what year was that? Something may have happened between Washington being a state and a territory, where like Washington Territory would not pass suffrage until there was a federal amendment, and then Washington became a state and things changed a bit.
Oh.
That could be a factor. Yeah, any other questions? I think another thing I took away from this suffrage history of Washington is that, it takes a long time to achieve, it took a long time, generations, to achieve this victory. And, you just can't give up the fight. Susan B. Anthony didn't live she fought for her whole life, and so did, oh boy, I can't remember her name. Anyway, most of all of the early suffragists who dedicated their lives to this, I only saw a bunch of defeat, and never lived to see it pass in 1920. But that doesn't mean that they didn't pave the way, that their work didn't mean anything. Yes?
You mentioned that the liquor industry was very successfully blocked us at many points. I was wondering how that continued, and are there other industries that gave a lot of money so he wouldn't be able to vote? Yeah,
as I mentioned, there were the Grange and a lot of Christian organizations backed women's suffrage early on because their values were aligned with women. They thought that they were also, these Christian organizations were also trying to pass prohibition and knew that if they had women behind them, they would be able to achieve that. And so...
No, my question was conversely, were there businesses that were working
other
against
businesses
this?
Other than liquor?
Yes.
Liquor is the big one, but yeah, no other industries specifically that I can think of, like mining industries or tobacco industries or anything like that. Not that I've read, but I'm sure there were. I'm sure there were.
Any other questions? Oh, thank you, Elisa.
Yeah, thank you.